Brian McDonough. Good day.
Hello, Mario.
Hello, hello. Brian, you're the director of the Social Action Justice for the Archdiocese, Catholic Archdiocese of Montreal.
That's right. I am the director of the Social Action Office at the Catholic Archdiocese of Montreal. And also, I was a member of the Regional Advisory Committee of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And in that role, I was involved in some of the preparations, some of the activities around the national event that was held in Montreal from the 24th to the 27th of April this year. I also found myself speaking with the media and contributing with representatives of other churches to making, for example, a special birthday party at the end of the event happen and work with a lot of the volunteers.
Why should the churches be involved in the healing process of the people who were in the residential schools?
Now, that's an important question. It's important to look at this in a historical perspective. When you had the original missionaries present here at the beginning of the colony, the French colony, Ville-Marie and Nouvelle-France, for a short while, there was an effort to create special schools for Aboriginal children. So we think of Marguerite Bourgeois. You see a beautiful painting of her behind there. But after a few years, it was understood that that approach was not going to work. And so you had missionaries in the 17th and 18th century that were more concerned with actually learning the language, appreciating cultures. I'm thinking about Jean de Brebeuf. Already in 1629, he was in Huronia, trying to learn the language, respecting the culture. And so it's important to recognize that the churches were involved in this encounter. Yes, with their biases, with their attitudes, shaped by a certain worldview that came with European culture. But something very major happened in the 19th century and the first part of the 20th century, where the churches became partners of the federal government in establishing residential schools whose primary purpose was the assimilation of Aboriginal culture and the repression of Aboriginal languages. The churches were involved in this process. It was financed by the federal government, but religious brothers and sisters and members of other religious groups and other churches found themselves running these residential schools. And the admitted purpose of this was essentially to eliminate First Nations as a distinct cultural and linguistic entity. That was expressed clearly by a deputy minister of Aboriginal Affairs in the 1920s. So we have a role in recognizing our complicity in this tragic period of our relationship with Aboriginal peoples and beginning to repair that damage so that we can build solid, healthy relationships with First Nations, with Aboriginal peoples of Canada.
But Brian, how Christians should react? Should they feel guilty of something in that, or should they feel something else? Because, for example, at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the judge Mary Sinclair just underlined that the fact is that we are not here to condemn anybody. So how Christians should react in front of this part of their story?
Okay. Couple caveats. First thing I want to point out that most Aboriginal people in Canada are indeed Christians, and many of them have a deeply rooted commitment to the Christian faith and see themselves as disciples of Jesus. There's a deep bonding with Jesus that is experienced in many communities. So there is a danger of creating kind of a false dualism, a false duality between Aboriginal peoples who would be traditionalists, and on the other hand, white society that would be uniformly Christian. I think that's not a helpful dichotomy. It's not a helpful dualism. We have to go beyond that. And secondly, and this is a message that I received from many Aboriginal people, it is a dangerous dynamic when you start thinking about, white society as having been the abusers or the aggressors, if you want, and Aboriginal people as being the victims. That kind of dichotomy, that kind of dualism does not help us go forward. Yes, Christians, Christian churches, and people of faith must recognize that there were abuses, that there was, physical punishment and indeed sexual aggressions that are absolutely not acceptable. And we have to recognize that and seek to repair for those evil actions that were done. We have to. But we have to move beyond that. And this is an invitation that I've heard from many Aboriginal people. We have to move beyond that logic of aggressor, victim. Because somehow we become paralyzed in that kind of dynamic. We have to move beyond that. And I think there are different ways of doing that. But certainly the first step is to listen with respect and compassion to the suffering of the survivors of residential schools, but not remain there, but to, having heard that and listened deeply, seek to move forward.
On which point can we say that the church can help in the healing process?
Well, first thing, I think the churches have an important role in sensitizing the general public about the richness of Aboriginal cultures, their spiritual heritage. We have something to do in that sense that's really very important. I think that the churches also can contribute to a larger understanding of the complex relationship between European peoples that arrived in the late 16th century, 17th century, and the First Nations. A relationship that was complex. Certainly the European settlers would not have been able to survive without the help of Aboriginal people. And also white people, through their governments and through economic structures, were responsible for, pushing Aboriginal people off their land and destroying their capacity of livelihood. These things have to be admitted. And I think the churches have a role in speaking with this. But I think as also we can go beyond that. I think of, for example, ecumenical networks for justice and peace, who are very interested in working with Aboriginal peoples on issues regarding natural resources, the overexploitation of forests, the destruction of waterways. I think there's a solidarity there that has to be developed. And I think it very, very interesting that groups like Development and Peace that have been looking over the last couple of years about ecological justice and our relationship with the natural resources, we have something to work in that direction with Aboriginal peoples. And I think that if you look at the thought of Pope Benedict XVI, Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, there's a very real sense in his writings. I'm thinking about his message for the World Day of Peace of 2010 about if you want peace, protect creation. There's a sense in his writing about how nature, about creation, is a sign of God's presence. It's a sacrament in many ways. And there's something that can be developed there. And as I think that kind of sensitivity, that awareness of creation as a gift from God becomes a basis for a dialogue with Aboriginal people and their culture, and indeed with traditionalists in Aboriginal peoples. I think there's a basis there. I also think that perhaps some of our church leaders can seek to develop relationships of friendship, of respectful listening. Could we imagine, for example, some of our church leaders, some bishops and others, meeting with the heads of Aboriginal communities at at Kahnawake or Kanasatake or at Odanak and Wendake? I think there's something that can be done there. Foster better relations. And I think also that we can envisage a better collaboration with the Assembly of First Nations of Quebec and Labrador on issues that are of concern for them. We can think about, for example, the development of the North. What place will really be given to Aboriginal peoples and their concerns? With the Plan Nord or Le Nord pour tous. What are we doing there? So I think there's something. And I also would suggest, and this I'm speaking personally, that looking at the whole tragedy of residential schools and listening to the experience of Aboriginal peoples becomes a way of deepening our own Christian faith. Personally, I have wondered how Aboriginal people who were survivors of these residential schools were able to continue to affirm their belief in Jesus Christ. Many of them experienced a betrayal of the gospel, and yet these persons have felt the need to adhere and speak about their commitment to the Christian faith. Mm-hmm. That speaks deeply to me. What can I learn in terms of their spiritual riches, of their depth of spiritual experience? That's where I'm at this point.
Brian McDonough, thank you very much.
It's always a great pleasure to speak with you, Mario.